Okay, we are continuing in the book of Acts this week and really finishing out what is the first half of the book of Acts. 1 to 12 really makes up one clear section, and then chapters 13 to the end are another clear section. And so hopefully some things we'll say today show how this is such a huge transition point in the book of Acts. And then next week, as we get into 13 and following, we'll talk about how the second half is different. But let's look at chapters 7 to 12 of the book of Acts. Okay, the first thing that we'll notice picks up from where we ended last week with Stephen's death, stoned for proclaiming the message of Jesus in front of the Jewish council. And chapter 8 tells us that that persecution of Stephen actually led to a further spreading of the gospel, and a similar statement is made in chapter 11. But this is what we see in the book of Acts. We've made a comparison in past videos, I think, to the story in the book of Daniel, where the stone that represents the kingdom of God comes and crushes the other nations and then grows and fills the whole earth. And in the book of Acts, we see that no matter what people do to try to stop the spread of the gospel, that persecution even only leads to people going more places and telling more people about Jesus. So in chapter 8, we have Philip doing that both with the villages of Samaria and also with the Ethiopian eunuch who is traveling down the road. And again, other efforts in chapters 11 and 12 to stamp out the Christians. In fact, another martyr, James, will be executed in chapter 12. We see that those efforts are foolish. Those that, like Herod, that go through with that pay the price. And the Christians themselves continue boldly to proclaim the message, and more people are brought into the kingdom. Okay, speaking of the spread of the kingdom, we find out more about Saul and see the account of him being converted. And this story will be told 3 times in the book of Acts. He will retell the story himself later on. And so you know this story is important because of the emphasis that's placed on. Here we have Saul of Tarsus, who is the chief persecutor of the Christians. Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus, where he is going to persecute more Christians. He is humbled, and he is baptized by Ananias, and he immediately begins preaching. And in many ways, we use the word call because this story of Saul of Tarsus is similar to stories like the prophet Isaiah or the prophet Jeremiah, when God appeared to them and said, hey, I have chosen you to go and to preach my message to the people. And Saul is told that exact same thing by God, that he's been chosen to be a spokesman for God, a light specifically, he says, to the Gentiles and to the nations. And that is the other major shift that we're seeing in this point of the book of Acts, which is that starting in chapter 10, when Peter preaches to Cornelius, Gentiles are welcomed into the kingdom. Peter will retell the story in chapter 11, showing how important this is as well. But the story is told specifically to mirror the story in Acts chapter 2, that in the same way the gospel was preached and received by the Jews in Acts chapter 2, now in chapter 10 the gospel is being preached and received by Gentiles as well, and God is putting his stamp of approval on this, because it would have been a difficult thing for Peter, we see that at the beginning of this story, and others we see in chapter 11, to understand this idea that non-Jewish people ethnically would be allowed into the kingdom of God that was promised to them and given to them through the law of Moses and through the prophets. But that's exactly what's happening here. And these two things really set up the rest of the book that will focus largely on Saul, who is referred to more so as Paul as the story goes on. But we see Saul being one of the chief proponents of the gospel throughout all nations, preaching to Jews and mainly to Gentiles as the gospel continues to spread like that stone in the book of Daniel and fill the whole earth. And that's what we'll continue to see going forward in 13 and following. But for now, notice these key transition points at this crucial juncture in the book of Acts, and come back next week as we continue in the book of Acts in our 2020 Bible reading.